Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to this week's explained session. A session where we take some of the most important and relevant topics that have been in the news in the past few days, try and explain those topics in extreme detail with specialist focus on what exactly are those topics relevant for our examination point of view. Today's topic is the unfortunate event of the killing of ex-Japanese Prime Minister Mr. Shinzo Abe. In the light of this incident, today in this explained session, we will be discussing about the life and legacy of Shinzo Abe. What role exactly did he play in India-Japanese relationship? Also, we'll be discussing about how exactly would the country of Japan remember him. We'll also be focusing upon a term that is phrased on his name, that is Abenomics, and his role in the Quad coming into being. However, before we do all of that and especially focus on India-Japanese relationship, first we'll focus on the fact that he lost his life due to a gun attack. Now this especially made news internationally because of various reasons. One of the reasons is when you consider Japan as a country, as a society, it is considered to be one of the most peaceful and law-loving society in the entire world. Meaning that the Japanese people pride themselves in being extremely law-abiding citizens, and that is why there has never been a culture of this kind of gun violence in Japan. In fact, owning a gun in Japan and gun deaths in Japan, especially of prominent people, is extremely rare. And that is why it caught the attention of the entire world, apart from the obvious fact that this was a very high-profile assassination. Usually, you associate these unfortunate incidents of gun culture, gun violence, etc. in nations such as the US, where it is extremely easy to go and buy any gun. You can just walk into a supermarket, buy guns. However, in nations such as Japan, this is extremely rare. And that is why the news media around the world reported that the gun that was used by the attacker was actually essentially a homemade gun. As you can see in the photo here, this was a homemade gun that had a lot of tape, wrapping, etc. And that is how that gun was actually arranged by the killer. Anyway, it is an extremely unfortunate incident. Now, just to share with you some data and some facts with regards to gun culture in Japan or the lack of gun culture in Japan. This is a report taken from the BBC. In their report, they have shown how if you look at the G7 nations, some of the most advanced and some of the most developed nations in the world, and you see how many people in these nations actually own a firearm as a civilian, you would see that Japan comes right at the bottom. In fact, it is many times lower than any of the other G7 nations. Thus, it is a very rare occurrence for any civilian in Japan to actually own a firearm. It's a very difficult process. You have to give a lot of proof, you have to give a lot of reasoning, then you have to pass some psychoanalysis test. Only and only then you would be allowed to carry a firearm. Because of this, even the incidents that are related to gun deaths in Japan are extremely rare. Again, this data has been taken from BBC publications and it shows gun deaths in the G7 nations. Again, it's not a surprise that because of so few guns in society in Japan in the hands of the civilians, the number of deaths due to gun violence in Japan is at an extremely low level. Not even comparable to other G7 nations. As you can see, US is head and shoulders above every other G7 nation, unfortunately, and even other nations such as Canada, Italy, France, UK, Germany do not have a very good record. But unfortunately, what happened in Japan is a reality, and that is why there are a lot of introspections that are going on in the Japanese society and Japanese government. In the international media, in fact, it is being reported that it might bring a lot of reforms, and owning gun or even owning these kind of materials that enable you to make a homemade gun would become even more stringent in Japan in the coming years. Now, let's bring back our focus to specifically what is relevant for us. That is, when Shinzo Abe's news of death actually came up, across the world there was a feeling of mourning. In India also, especially, the top leaders of the government, including the Prime Minister, made several tweets, first wishing him good health, praying for his recovery, and then when the news came of him passing away, sending out condolence messages. Here you see one of the tweets given by our Prime Minister. Now, this is not a very rare occurrence that a Prime Minister is actually sending condolences tweets to some other leader. However, in case of Shinzo Abe, everyone across the country and even outside India knew about the fact that he actually shared a very, very special relationship with India. One of the reasons why now India and Japan share a very fruitful and warm relationship, especially in the past decade or decade and a half, is because of the leadership of Shinzo Abe in Japan. And we'll also discuss what exactly were the roles that he played in bringing India and Japan closer. Let me take you back to 2007. 2007 was a time that India and Japan, although we always had a good equation, but we were not very close as compared to what we are today. It was in 2007 that Shinzo Abe actually gave an address to the Indian Parliament where he talked about the confluence of the two seas. He talked about the fact that in this Indo-Pacific region, if we have to ensure that peace is maintained, if we have to ensure that the dominance of China is checked, then two of the biggest democracies in terms of their economy, apart from China, in this region would have to come together. It is said that this is the speech that actually led to the idea of Quad coming into the picture, and we'll discuss that as well. It is not a surprise that India, after years and years of negotiations, after years and years of trying, was finally able to sign the civil nuclear deal with Japan in 2016 when Shinzo Abe was leading the Japanese government. Now, signing this deal of nuclear energy with Japan specifically was a game changer for India, and I'll tell you the reasons why. If you look at the major companies around the world that are working in this sector of nuclear energy, maybe building nuclear power plants, supplying the components, or making sure that the research work goes on, almost all of these countries have their parent company in Japan. So much so that many experts believe that it is almost impossible for any nation to have a successful civil nuclear program if Japan does not give its permission to the companies to supply the required components and supply the required information to those nations. This is where having such an agreement with Japan has always been a high priority for India. However, you also have to understand that despite India and Japan having good relationship when it comes to trade, investment, people, diplomacy, etc., the one topic on which the two nations had a lot of disagreement was actually nuclear energy. And there are good enough reasons for that. Do understand this from the point of view of Japan as well. Nations around the world talk about the fact that nuclear energy is bad and its misuse should be stopped, and everyone criticizes it. But if you look at nations around the world and you look at one single nation, the only nation that actually has had to face the consequences of what that energy or what that bomb can do is actually Japan. While all other nations read about those consequences in the book, they fear about those consequences, but in reality the only nation that has really faced those consequences is Japan. And that is why it is no wonder that Japan has always been very, very strictly against the misuse of nuclear energy. As a result of which, when India conducted its nuclear test in Pokhran, Japan was one of the first nations around the world to come out in the open and heavily criticize India. They even put some sanctions on India, which carried on for some years. Before, it was US that tried to convince Japan, and these two nations came together to understand that India went and did this nuclear test in good faith only for our protection. That was the only time after our independence that India-Japanese relations have not been great, specifically in terms of nuclear energy. And that is why for Japan to come out on the open and sign a civil nuclear deal with India without India being a part of the NPT. As you know, India is not a part of NPT, Non-Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is thus India's promises to the developed nation that we will not misuse this power, on the basis of which Japan was actually willing to sign this. That also underlines the fact that Shinzo Abe had a lot of trust in the Indian government, and that actually translated into this agreement. He also saw that India and Japan share a common vision if we have to counter the Chinese aggression. And that became a driving point in the bilateral relations between India and Japan. Although Japan has always supported Indian economy in many ways. Let me give you an example. We usually believe that it was only after the 1991 reforms that foreign brands started coming into India, that there were collaboration between Indian businesses and other businesses. But if you actually realize, one international brand that came to India much before 1991 reforms was actually Suzuki. Remember Maruti Suzuki, which has now become Maruti Udyog, but Maruti Suzuki was actually collaboration between Indian Maruti company and the Suzuki company of Japan, which was one of the first big companies from foreign or developed nations to actually enter India and have this successful collaboration. Thus, it proves the fact that Japan has always been a supporter of Indian economy doing well. Under their ODA, that is the Official Development Assistance, under which a lot of developed nations actually gave a lot of grant to developing nations. Under the ODA program also, Japan has always been supporting a lot of developmental projects in India. Some of the most advanced projects in India, be it the Delhi Metro, be it the now under construction high-speed bullet train between Ahmedabad and Mumbai, all of these have been done and are still ongoing with the Japanese collaboration in some way or the other. If you look at how the life of Shinzo Abe actually coincided with India-Japan relations, this is a small graph that will help you understand this. 2007, Quad came into existence under leadership of Shinzo Abe and other leaders. This was the same year in which he delivered the famous Conference of the Two Seas speech in the Indian Parliament. In 2014, the relations between the two sides upgraded to a special strategic and global partnership level. In 2015, he was invited to be the chief guest at India's 26th January Republic Day parade. 2017, under his leadership, foundation was laid of Mumbai-Ahmedabad bullet train project. These are just the major pointers of Shinzo Abe's life and how it coincided with India-Japan relations. There are a lot of other things that happened in between that, but let's focus on this specifically. Although Shinzo Abe will be remembered in Japan and many nations around the world, in India especially he will be remembered for his role that he played in ensuring that the two countries, India and Japan, come closer than ever. For example, he talked multiple times about a joint vision that the two nations share. Be it a nation of an independent and free Indo-Pacific, be it a vision of trying to stop the aggressive nature of China, be in fact the vision of both the nations wanting to be a permanent member in the UN Security Council. As you know, India and Japan are members of the G4 group along with Brazil and Germany that have been demanding reforms in the UN Security Council and that have been demanding a permanent seat for themselves in the UN Security Council. This is also where the two nations have collaborated multiple times. Japan, as a part of the G7, also has ensured that whenever the G7 people have a meeting, whenever these nations come together, indirectly India also has a representation there in form of Japan. Because we understand the fact that Japan would not allow any of the declaration to be against India. A lot of infrastructural development projects in India have taken place with the Japanese help, be it the technical assistance or be it the financial assistance. The most recent one of those is the bullet train project. Now, if you saw in the news today, the news was that new Maharashtra Chief Minister has announced that he will be putting this project on a fast track, saying that the previous government neglected this, but now we will complete it very quickly. Not just this, Japan has also ensured India's participation in the Act East Forum, and multiple projects in the northeast part of India have also been sponsored by Japan in multiple ways. There are multiple joint projects that have taken place outside India as well. Development of multiple ports in Sri Lanka, Maldives, all of this is happening when China is watching very, very closely, but the two sides, India and Japan, are still coming together. The civil nuclear deal, as we discussed. And also, since 2019, we have had foreign ministers and the defense ministers of the two sides meeting. Now, this is also something very, very unique. And I'll tell you why. Mostly when you read about the world history and when you read NCERT books in world history, usually they end at the Second World War ending with the atomic bombs being dropped on Japan and Japan surrendering. But a lot of us ignore about what happened to Japan after that. So let me tell you what happened to Japan a few years after the atomic bomb were dropped and the Second World War ended. Now, when Japan surrendered, America was always fearful that Japanese leadership will take revenge for what we did. And Americans could not afford another Pearl Harbor to actually take place. Thus, after the Second World War ended, a lot of American troops, a lot of American military actually stayed back in Japan for many years, just to ensure that there is no rebellion that is brewing up in the country. At that point of time, America also decided that the old Japanese constitution has to be removed and we have to make a new constitution. So a new Japanese constitution came up, which was mainly designed by the inputs given by US. The inputs given by US. So a lot of military leaders there were actually monitoring how this constitution came into picture. And that is why if you actually read the Japanese constitution that they have today, it is very, very similar with a lot of very, very similar provisions of the US constitution. Because again, it was the same ideology that the US wanted to imprint the Japanese constitution as well. However, one very interesting point in the Japanese constitution was about the fact that Japanese government cannot declare war, or the country of Japan officially cannot declare a war. This is actually written in their constitution. Because America was so fearful that what might happen tomorrow that they wrote it specifically in their constitution. And that is why, if you notice this, the Japanese army, the Japanese air force, they are not called army. They are called Japanese self-defense forces. They are called Japanese self-defense forces. The reason being that they officially cannot start a war. If someone attacks Japan, yes, they have an army to defend, but they won't actually engage in starting a war. Because of this, for many, many decades, Japan has maintained that they don't want to engage in any joint military exercises. For many years, Japan had actually said we will not export any weapon to any nations. They hardly had any interaction of their defense minister with some other nation's defense minister. But this has changed in the past decade or so, specifically under Shinzo Abe. So now Japan collaborating with India in the field of defense, in the field of military exercises, in the field of weapons is actually a big deal, because in a way, I won't say they are violating their constitution, but in a way, their foreign policy is taking a major turn, because earlier their foreign policy was not to engage in any such conversations, and now this is changing. This also happened under Shinzo Abe. As I said, Shinzo Abe introduced a lot of very significant changes in Japanese foreign policy. He was the longest serving Prime Minister of Japan, and that is why his imprint in Japan is still very, very relevant. He established Japan as a leader in Indo-Pacific. Earlier, Japan was a kind of a developed nation, happy to be in its own place, not really worrying about what is happening in the neighborhood. But now, in the past decade or so, they have been much more assertive, and they have established themselves as a leader in the Indo-Pacific region. They have also multiple times talked about global concerns. Earlier, they were not really very keen to be a part of a lot of multilateral organizations. That have also changed. They have had constant deliberations with nations such as India, Australia in the form of Quad. They have also had very frequent meetings with South Korea with a special focus on China. As I told you, the significant build or the significant change in the Japanese foreign policy in terms of armed forces, in terms of how the defense of Japan would work, was also under Shinzo Abe. Although he could not change Article 9 of the Constitution, that is not allowing the government to declare a war. However, he actually went ahead and ensured that his armed forces are much more active and are even taking part in overseas operations as well. He also ensured that the US-Japanese military alliance becomes much, much stronger. Although US and Japan have always had good relationship ever since that Pearl Harbor and atomic bomb incident of Second World War. However, it was under him that they became even closer. He is also considered as one of the architects of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Deal. It was supposed to be a game changer, but unfortunately, with Donald Trump coming into power, the TPP could not really achieve its objectives. Now, one of the interesting parts about Shinzo Abe, and one phrase that is associated with him, is Abenomics. Means, when he came to power in 2012, he introduced a new kind of economics that actually changed the path of Japan. And let me explain to you what exactly is Abenomics. Now, Japan, unlike India and unlike many other developed nations, has its own set of very different problems. It's a developed nation. It has a lot of money. The people are rich. The infrastructure is good. However, the interesting part is that it is actually a tendency of the Japanese people that they don't spend a lot of money. They earn good amounts of money, but they prefer saving it because that is how they have been taught, that is how they have been educated. For them, saving money makes more sense, and they are not someone who actually would spend a lot of money and live a glamorous life. Now, it might sound good on one hand, but the problem is if most people in the country live such a life that they don't want to spend a lot of money, that automatically means the demand will come down. For example, today in India, if everyone starts to think, no, we don't want to buy a car, let's walk to work, let's walk to friend's place, let's walk to market, then what will happen to car companies? What will happen to thousands and lakhs of people who are employed either in the car companies or in the companies associated with those? The tire companies, the steel industry, all these industries where so many people are working, what will happen to them? Means when you have such a situation where most of the people in the country don't want to spend a lot of money, the demand actually comes down. So much so that in 2012, when he actually became the Prime Minister, the GDP growth rate of Japan actually went down minus 4.3%. And that is when he had a big challenge in its hands. He thought that there are a number of reforms that have to be introduced. He has to introduce fiscal policy in a new form, monetary policy, and bring structural reforms. Now, there were multiple problems. The first problem, as I discussed, consumers just not spending enough. So what he did was, he wanted to bring more money into the hands of the people. He wanted to spend money in some other way. If the people directly are not spending the money, let the government spend the money. How will the government spend the money? By building new infrastructure, by employing people, asking them to build new infrastructure so that they can earn money from the government and money can now flow in the economy. So he introduced a big plan to spend about 10.3 trillion yen to improve infrastructure and generate more employment opportunities in Japan. In 2014, he increased 5.5 trillion yen more to this budget. The purpose was to spend more money and convince the people you don't need to save a lot of money. Let the money flow in the economy, because when everyone just starts to save, that becomes a problem because there is a stalemate in the economy, there is not enough demand. So this was his first idea. Second, he also tried to convince the central bank to ensure that giving money to the people becomes easier. So much so that when he became the Prime Minister, even before that, the Central Bank of Japan had actually ensured that there is a 0% rate of interest on loans. Imagine 0%. Convincing people to take a loan so that they can spend money in the market, even when it's not earning any rate of interest. When Shinzo Abe came to power, he went one step ahead, convincing the central bank to actually take it to minus percentage. Can you imagine minus rate of interest? Means giving people the money to actually take a loan, asking them take a loan of 12 lakh, only return 10 lakh, don't worry. That is what he did to give a push and ensure that there is much more money supply into the market now. That was also an integral part of his economy. Now that also meant that he would have to print more money. Now in a country such as India, when you read about economics and you think why is it the government not printing more money, the one answer you get is inflation, right? That when you print more money there would be inflation. But inflation happens when you actually have a demand for products. But in Japan, when there was no demand, the people were not buying anything. They were happy in traveling in 8, 10, 12-year-old cars. They don't want to buy anything new. The problem with Japan was they had no inflation at all for many, many years. And no inflation is also a very, very bad sign. That means your economy is not progressing. Even when you see the monetary policy of India, the inflation target that we have is 4% plus minus 2. So we also understand that at least 2% inflation is required. In fact, he made it a goal that he wants to have at least 2% inflation. Japanese economy for a long time was going through a 0% inflation phase, which was very, very bad. The other problem that Japan had and still continues to have is of aging population. If you look at the average age of Japan right now, it is approaching 50. Just imagine that. Average age of a Japanese is 50. Now in developed nations, this is a trend that the average ages actually increase because of two reasons. Number one, the healthcare facilities are so good that people live a long life. You don't expect people dying in their 60s or even 70s because their healthcare facilities are very, very good. Similarly, the people are educated and they know that they don't want to have more children, so they maybe reproduce only one kid or they don't have any kid at all. Meaning that your birth rate is going down and your death rate is also going down. So the population actually reaches a stage where the average age increases. So much so that in Japan, the average age is, as I said, close to 50. Now there are multiple problems associated with that. There are lack of young people in the nation means lack of labor force. You can't expect people in their 60s and 70s to be a part of the labor force. Even if they are, that will be to a very, very small extent. So Japan for a long time has been suffering from lack of labor force, mainly because of lack of birth rate. People were just not interested to have more kids. Now what he did was, he also spent a lot of money from the government side to actually ensure that we have social welfare programs to boost birth rate. In a way, convincing the people not to worry about the expenses of their children. Convincing the people to have more children because the government has infrastructure to take care of them. Now I won't say that this has translated into something that has actually been a success so far, but at least it's a step in the right direction. All of these measures together are a part of Abenomics that he introduced. And it is said that after this, at least there is a positive change that can be seen in the Japanese economy. As you can see here by numbers. He first came to power in 2012. And see that. The unemployment rate in Japan since then has been on a constant decline. That has been the impact of Abenomics. And it has been accepted by nations around the world, economists around the world. Now, if we focus a bit on India-Japan relations, keeping the life of Shinzo Abe aside, India-Japan relations have gone through very, very interesting times. Since our independence, after the end of the Second World War, we have tried to maintain good relationship with Japan. In the beginning in 1950s, the two sides shared great relationship, and I'll give you two very interesting examples. The photo that you see here is actually in Japan's Kyoto. This photo that you actually see is of an Indian judge called Radha Binod Pal. There's a very interesting story about this judge and his connection with Japan. Some of you might know, some of you might not know. After the Second World War ended, nations around the world, specifically the ones who won the war, decided to form an international tribunal of judges, where judges from multiple nations were actually invited. to hear a case against those nations that started the war. Germany, Japan, etc. The job of the judges was to decide who is guilty for all this damage, for all this humongous loss of life, loss of property, and what punishment should be given. In this International Tribunal of Judges, specifically for Japan, called the East Asia Tribunal mainly, in that particular tribunal, there were 3 judges from Asia. One of the judges, the only judge from India, was Justice Radha Binod Pal. The interesting part is, in the entire tribunal of judges, he was the only one who actually took the side of Japan. He took Japan's side. He was the only one to actually give a dissent note. What is a dissent note? Dissent note is when a judge does not agree with the majority judgment. He was the only one who said that this tribunal is an act of revenge against Japan. It is unfair and it should not actually punish those who are in Japan because they had their own reasons. Since then, he has been considered as a hero figure in Japan, and there are multiple statues and photos of him that you can find across Japan. Since then, the India-Japanese relationship started on a great note. Then there is one other interesting story related to this picture. Now, earlier in the 1950s and 60s, there was a trend of a lot of people writing letters to their leaders. Even today, you do see some people writing letters, but this is a diminishing art now. It is said that Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru actually got a letter from a kid in Japan requesting him to send an elephant to Japan because Japan did not have any elephants. Prime Minister Nehru heeded to that advice, request, and actually sent an elephant to Japan. This elephant was named, you can guess it, Indra. So elephant Indra was actually sent to Japan from India as a gift. The elephant actually was kept in Tokyo Zoo and it became a major attraction for kids in Japan especially. This was also a kind of an indication that India wants to have good, cordial relationship with Japan. Ever since our independence, as I said, India-Japanese relationship have usually been good. I also gave you an example of how Suzuki became the first major global nation to come to India even before the 1991 reforms. We have seen some of the major infrastructure projects in India financed or technologically held by Japan. The only problem that we have had in our relationship is, as I said, because of the nuclear tests that we conducted, which had nothing to do with Japan, but just because the Japanese history has taught them that the nuclear energy, if it is used in a wrong manner, can be so devastating that they were very, very angry with that test. If you take out that particular period of a few years, there has always been good relationship between India and Japan. Rather than taking you back into the history, I will share with you some of the recent examples of how the relationship between the two nations has developed. Recently in March 2022, the Japanese Prime Minister actually was on official visit to India for the 14th India-Japan Annual Summit. Japan, India and Australia recently came together to actually form an initiative called the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. This was mainly because in the wake of the COVID pandemic, supply chains around the world were disrupted because of China, lockdown in China, and because people did not really trust China anymore. Because of which, there was a financial and economic slowdown throughout the world. And these nations decided to come together to make their own robust supply chains. In 2020, India and Japan actually signed a logistics agreement also to allow armed forces of both sides to coordinate closely in services and supply. Now this again is a very, very significant agreement. It might not seem very significant, but if you look at the history of Japan, as I discussed, it is very significant. Because Japan has always been one of those nations that have not entered any defense agreements of even the smallest kinds. The only significant agreement that they have is kind of that nuclear guarantee from America, where America has told Japan, you don't need to work on atomic bombs, atomic weapons. If you need them, we will be the one who will be protecting you with that. So don't worry. Apart from that, there is hardly any significant defense agreement that Japan has signed because of what is written in their constitution. And that continues till today. We also have the India-Japanese Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, kind of a free trade agreement that came into being in August 2011. The two sides, that is India and Japan, also share a lot of common memberships, including the Quad, the G20, the G4, as we discussed, a group of 4 nations that are demanding reforms, and membership as a permanent member in the UN Security Council. Recently, as we discussed, when the Japanese Prime Minister was in India on the official visit, he made a big announcement. The announcement was that Japan is planning to invest $42 billion in India over the next 5 years, which is a major push towards India-Japan relations and how our infrastructure would get a boost from Japan. Most of the loans that we get from Japan are actually soft loans, including the ones that we are getting for the bullet train also. Soft loans means those loans which have a very long tenure. So loans having a very long tenure and negligible rate of interest. Negligible rate of interest. Because Japan right now has a lot of money with the government just lying there that they want to make good use of. Think of it from the Japanese point of view. They already have a lot of infrastructure in place. They don't really need to build a lot more infrastructure. They are an island nation, so they don't really have to worry about any land or armed conflict, except the fact that there is military assertiveness from China, but they do have guarantee from US also. So there are not a lot of things from where they can actually spend money. Most of their population is well-to-do. They don't really need a lot of welfare schemes from their government. So Japan has to make a conscious decision of how to best use that capital that they have. That is why they keep on choosing investment projects throughout the world, including a lot of them in India. Because of this announcement, you can expect that the India-Japanese relationship, especially in the field of economics, will only become better in the coming years or so, at least for the next 5 years. Having said all of that, there is also one other thing that you have to understand. Despite the great bilateral relations, despite the trust that we have in both the sides, the trade numbers between the two sides has not been that great. If you look at this, the latest numbers of 2021 will show you India's exports to Japan are close to $6 billion. While on the other hand, the Japanese exports to India are close to $13 billion. So you can actually see it has touched close to $19 billion. Close to 19 billion is what Indo-Japanese trade is. Now understand something here. There are two reasons why it will not go very high. Look at it from India's point of view. India is a developing nation, and in a developing nation, consumers, when you go and buy something from the market, your first priority is still that you want to take something which is value for money. You want to buy something which you think comes at a cheaper cost. Let's say you go and buy an air conditioner, okay? Let's say you have an option Voltas by the Tata, there is here that is of Chinese brand, and then maybe there's Panasonic. Now you might have, and I don't know the current rates of air conditioner, so excuse me if I'm not correct. So let's say there is Air, that is a Chinese company that will give you air conditioner for 27,000. Let's say Voltas will give you the same air conditioner for 30,000. Then we have Panasonic that will give you the air conditioner, same specification for 40,000. Now, it is well known that the Japanese machinery, Japanese technology is far superior, but as a consumer, I want to also see where can I spend the least money for that quality. So in a nation where people are very price conscious, it is not a very uncommon trend that you would not prefer Japanese products, although you know the quality is great, but you know they will be slightly more expensive. That is why you see that in India, there will never be a lot of demand of Japanese products, because that will always be a case. The more we develop, the more money comes in the hands of the people, you might see this trend changing. Then look at it from the Japanese point of view. As a Japanese citizen in the market, when you go, what kind of product would you buy? Again, you know that your quality is very, very high. You are living in a developed nation. So you also would prefer products coming in from those kind of nations. There is no bias against anyone, but this is just the mentality of common people of how they would buy products. They are not looking for the cheapest products in Japan. They are looking for the best quality products because they have the money to buy. That is why you will never expect that the two sides will have a very, very high numbers in trades, because that will not happen. That usually will not happen. Also, we don't really have a lot of Indian diaspora in Japan that they start buying Indian goods. So that also is a very rare occurrence. Now you might say that how is it that our trade numbers with US are good? They are also a developed nation. But with US, you also have to understand, when it comes to an English speaking nation, India does provide a lot of services also. So in our trade to US or our trade to EU, when we have a component of English speaking population, we also have this component of a lot of services, IT services being offered, which is not really the case with Japan. That is why it's a slightly different prospect in terms of Japan. Also, when you talk about Shinzo Abe and you talk about his impact on India-Japan relationship, you cannot ignore to talk about Quad. One of those groupings where India is a member, and India fortunately has been taking it very, very seriously in the past few years. The foundation of Quad actually came about in a different form of a group called Australia, India, Japan, US Tsunami Core Group in 2004. This was a time when Indo-Pacific faced a very, very horrific tsunami, and there were a lot of efforts that were being made by nations in this region to come together and provide relief to countries in the Indo-Pacific area. That is where these four nations actually came together, and it translated into the fact that we should work together under a common platform. Thus, in May 2007, you saw the Quad working level meeting in Manila, Philippines, and in August 2007, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe gave the famous confluence of the two C's speech in the Indian Parliament. This quickly led to Quad Plus meeting in Singapore as a maritime exercise. Now, that was a time in the first decade of the 21st century where the member nations were not taking Quad very seriously. It is only in the past few years that the member nations are taking Quad seriously because of increasing assertiveness of China. Even if you see from the Indian point of view, our view towards Quad has also increased, and we have become much more active ever since the Galwan clashes that we have had from China, because prior to that, there was always a kind of understanding that dialogue and diplomacy with China can actually resolve a lot of issues. But now that we have seen that the extent of the Chinese aggression can be very, very high, and we might have continuous long clashes, that is why we are also now understanding the fact that groupings such as BRICS, such as SCO, where China itself is a member, might not do a lot of good for India. Because those groupings where China is a member, they will always try to pressurize India in those groups, or will always have an upper hand. So we have always wanted a group with like-minded nations in a way that all of them share the same belief with India, and that is why we are seeing in the past few years especially, our complete point of view towards Quad has become much, much better. We are not giving as much importance to other groups such as BRICS and SCO, although there was a meeting held recently. But if you even see the statements coming in from the Indian government, from Indian leaders, they talk a lot more about Quad now as compared to BRICS and SCO, etc. The one misunderstanding about Quad that many people had was that it's kind of NATO, it's kind of a military alliance, but that is not the case. Multiple times, leaders of the Quad, that is India, Japan, Australia, US, have repeatedly said it is not a security alliance. It is not an alliance where one nation will come to protect the other nation when they are under attack by a third nation. That will not happen. It's not like NATO that attack on one is an attack against all of us. It is just an alliance where the nations are coming together on a common platform to discuss common concerns, make policies about it, collaborate on those issues. So it's not a security alliance, at least not till now. For Quad, there are a lot of criticisms and there are a lot of good things that are said even today. Many people say that they are just not doing enough. There are no joint military exercises as such on a large scale. It does not have a complete purpose. It's not a clarity. Is it an economic group? Is it a military group? It's a bit of everything right now. Many people say that maybe these nations don't want to have China in their bad books or don't want to confront China openly. And that is why they are finding an excuse not to say we are a military alliance or not to say we are an economic alliance, because China might not take that well. Anyways, China has said a lot of very contrasting things about Quad, that they don't appreciate how it is shaping up, they don't appreciate it has an anti-China stance. Although in their official declarations, Quad has never said we are anti-China. Some people say they are doing too much, they might put China into a more of an aggressive position, they might upset China. Also, they have excluded the ASEAN nations, which if you actually notice, are the ones that are at the most threat from China, territorially also due to the South China Sea issue and militarily also. So if the purpose is to ensure a independent and secure Indo-Pacific, you also have to include the ASEAN nations as well. Then the Quad has actually worked a bit of in very, very different domains. As I said, they are not focusing on one thing, it's a bit of every single thing. Let me give you some examples. In November 2019, there was a counter-terrorism tabletop exercise hosted by India. Then the same year, next month, December 2019, we have a cyber experts summit where these members participated. Then we had diplomats meet in different nations. In Brussels recently, they had a meeting. We also had military leaders meeting on the sidelines of the Assassination Dialogue. So a lot of, I don't want to sound negative, a lot of hodgepodge has been happening with Quad, with not any clear message coming out. What exactly do they want to achieve and how do they intend to achieve that? There's a bit of every single thing that is happening, and that is why many people say that they should come out in the open, make a statement, what exactly are they about and how exactly will they counter China. Most of these Quad nations, either all four or some of them, have also been taking part in other initiatives as well. For example, multiple nations have come together for COVID cooperation. We also have India, Japan, Australia, which I just discussed, having formed supply chain resilience initiatives. We also have global partnerships on artificial intelligence, disaster relief or disaster resilient infrastructure, etc. All of these have been made in some way or the other. So it's not just that Quad is the only way where India and Japan are collaborating or India and Australia are collaborating. There are multiple other initiatives where the two sides are actually coming together and trying to form a cordial relationship. This is everything that we have to cover today. This is everything that you need to know about the certain present condition of India-Japan relations, the impact that Shinzo Abe had, the legacy that he will leave in India-Japan relations, and also in Japan specifically. I hope you liked this video. If you did, do hit the like button. Share this video with your other aspirant friends as well. If you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel of BYJU'S IAS, please do that right away. And do comment what are the other topics on which you would like to have the next explained session. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.